This morning I did the second half of a Maimah Basi Lagani that I started on Friday. On Friday I had a shaitel. Now I look like a mensch. So the class is going to be half with the shaitel and half without a shaitel. Depends, you have to understand. If you understand class, you understand that that's also a shaitel. Okay, Rabbi Yossi, at 5 o'clock this morning, 6 o'clock this morning, I sent Rabbi Tzakanik a message. Maimer or Parsha? At 5 to 8, I got an answer. Parsha. So I said to him, okay, I'll do Parsha. But I didn't prepare. I spent my morning recording this Maimer, and I didn't prepare. So I'm unprepared. But this is a topic, you have to understand, I teach Parsha for many, many, many years. If you go to my website, many Parshas, Bereshis, Shmois, and Vayikra, and parts of Bamidbar, you can have as many as 10 classes per Parsha. Summer is less, because we have no yeshiva. One of the least represented Parshas is Miketz, because it's always Chanukah, and Chanukah is always vacation. So Chanukah, I think I have 4 classes, or 5 classes altogether in Parshas Miketz. I also looked this morning on my site, in the few minutes that I was still thinking to take a taxi. That page hasn't been fixed up, so I have some work to do today. But there's a topic that I've always wanted to do. And I dreamed one day of sitting down and spending an hour researching and looking it up and preparing it. Anyway, I had the time that I walked from my house to yeshiva to read as I walked in the streets the last Rabbeinu Bechayey Parshas Miketz. Here it is. And then I scribbled some notes as I was walking. So Bichlal, my handwriting is very creative. Every time I write, I create a new alphabet. This is particularly original. Our topic is the Asora Harugi Malchus, the 10 Martyrs. And I'm going to give you a lecture on it. I must warn you, I'm not going to be finished at 9 o'clock. If I was prepared, I would do it quicker, more concise. Preparation makes you more mitzumtzum. Lack of preparation makes you too verbose, too wordy, and that's part of the problem. I'm unprepared is a problem because I'm probably missing important components of the inyan. And the secondary problem is because I'm unprepared, I'm going to a little bit blabber. I don't like that, it's not my style, but I'm going to do it. I'm not prepared sufficiently. The Rabbeinu Bechayey says, in the end of Parshas Miketz, that Yosef's brothers are called Bnei Yaakov, the sons of Yaakov, or Achei Yosef, the brothers of Yosef, throughout the whole story, which begins this week and ends the beginning of next week. They go to get food. Yosef recognizes them. They don't recognize Yosef. Yosef plays huge mind games with them. He literally gets under their skin in an incredibly Josephistic way. That's a word that has absolutely no meaning. He really is very, very cool about keeping them off balance. It's remarkable how Yosef pulls it off. And throughout the story, they're called the sons of Jacob, the brothers of Yosef. 10 times exactly, they're called Anashim. They're not called Bnei Yaakov, they're not called Bechayey, it's called men. So the Rabbeinu Bechayey says that the 10th time they're called Anashim is a remez that we read in the Yom Kippur Musaf, in what's called Asar Arugi Melucha. We also read a Tisha B'Av in the Kinnis, that there were 10 of the greatest tzaddikim who ever lived, who were murdered al Kiddush Hashem, Rabbi Shmuel Keren Gadol, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, Rabbi Akiva ben Yosef, Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava, Rabbi Chanani ben Teradien, 10. I have their names written in the Rabbeinu Bechayey, but they were murdered al Kiddush Hashem. They were not killed at one time, even though when you read the story, it seems that they were all killed at one time. They were killed over the course of several hundred years, but they're considered a unit, and they died, like it says in the story, that in the Chumash it says, V'gein of Isha Mechorei. If you steal somebody and you sell them, the din is meis yumas. And the king of Rome said to them, if your grand ancestors were alive, I would kill them. The 10 Shvatim deserve to be killed in Dinei HaTorah. But because they're not here and I can't kill them, I think it's only fair, this is called Goyish justice, that someone has to die instead of the 10 Shvatim, so you're going to be murdered in 10 of the 10 Shvatim. And that's why you have 10 times the words Anoshim, which corresponds to the Asara Haruge Melucha. Another thing Rabbeinu Bechayey says, which is really sweet and uncomfortable, is the last words of Parshas Miketz read, quote, V'atem alu l'sholem el avichem. And you go up in peace to your father, right? Yosef HaTzadik says, I'm going to keep Binyamin because he stole my goblet, he stole my beaker. They found Gvias Yosef in the bag of Binyamin. V'atem alu l'sholem el avichem. You go home to your fathers in peace. And it says alu to go up. So the Rabbeinu Bechayey says, Alu l'sholem el avichem shabashabayim, go up in peace to your fathers in heaven, because this is a reference to the Asara Arugi Melucha, to the 10 martyrs. That's how Parshas Miketz finishes. Now, two details that are significant. Number one, these Parshas, Vayeshu Miketz, V'yigish Vayechi, are considered Golos Parshas. The Shalah writes this, the famous Shalah, that Parshas Vayeshu Miketz, V'yigish Vayechi are called Tzayin Yosef, they're Golos Parshas. That's why Chanukah falls always Vayeshu Miketz Vayigash, because Chanukah, even though it happened during the time of the second Beis HaMikdash, is actually considered a Golus Yom Tov, and that's why in these parshas you have so many dreams, because Shir HaMales, Hayinu Kecholmim, one of the Simanim of Golus is dreams, so Vayeshu Miketz has dreams to indicate, and perhaps Vayigash also has dreams, to indicate that we're dealing with the times of Golus. So,
because of Chanukah?
No, if I can't. Chanukah is in these parshas, because these parshas, the famous verse from the Shalah, that the Parshas Shavua are connected to the time of year, even though they're not connected. Where is that Shalah written? It's in Parshas Vayeshev. It's about Chanukah. That's the source. It never brings it in 100 sichas. It's about Chanukah, that Chanukah is a Golus Yom Tov, even though it occurred in the second Beis HaMikdash. That's why it's connected to Vayeshev Miketz, V'yigish Vayechi, which the Shalah calls Tzayin Yosef, because these are Golus parshas. And of course, therefore, it's in these parshas that you have a remes to the Asara Arugi Melucha, to the 10 martyrs. And the last thing, I heard this from my father-in-law, and I think he said he heard from the Rebbe, but it's not in the Rabbeinu Bechayey, that there shouldn't be 10 martyrs, there should only be 9. Reuven wasn't there. Reuven didn't approve. Reuven was upset. So why are there 10 martyrs? There should be only 9 martyrs. Reuven wasn't there. Obviously, Yosef can't be blamed. Binyamin wasn't there. So why are there 10 martyrs? And the answer says in Sfarim, because they made a shvuah with a minyan. They didn't have a minyan, they had only 9, so the 10th was the Eibishter himself. So one of the Asara Arugi Melucha is dying for Hashem. There's 10 Arugi Melucha that they're dying for the 9 martyrs plus the Eibishter. Which of the Asara Arugi Malchus is dying for the Eibishter? Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva ben Yosef was murdered for the Eibishter's Hishtadfus in Mechiras Yosef. Now, if Mechiras Yosef is something that the Eibishter desires, nobody should die. It's a good thing. If Mechiras Yosef is a bad thing, that means the Eibishter did a bad thing, but someone has to die in his place. So you've got a conundrum, you've got an unanswerable question, you've got a circular question which seems insoluble. So Rabbi Sai, the class starts now. What I just said in the last 9 minutes with Shalom Aleichem, the class starts now. Story number 1. I want you to halt cup, okay? I'm going to present an idea to you, which is, I think, important, and but it's involved. Story number 1. The Alter Rebbe had a chassid whose name was the Pinchas Reizes. The Pinchas Reizes was an incredibly great chassid, unbelievably great chassid. He was such a big chassid that when the Alter Rebbe would roll on the floor in the middle of Chassidus, and he would mutter words, the Pinchas Reizes stood right next to the Alter Rebbe. He would roll with the Alter Rebbe to hear those words, and he would write down the Alter Rebbe's words verbatim, word for word. We have an entire volume of printed Chassidus called Hanochas Harap, Ma'amori Ad Morazak and Hanochas Harap, because his Hanochas were considered the best. The Alter Rebbe had 5 manichim, the other 4 were his family members. His brother, 2 sons, and a grandson, the Tzemach Tzedek. And the 5th maniach was the Pinchas Reizes. The Pinchas Reizes was a multi-millionaire, was very, very rich. And he died childless. He came to the Alter Rebbe and begged the Alter Rebbe for children multiple times. And the Alter Rebbe, the Alter Rebbe didn't give him children. On one occasion, the Alter Rebbe said to him, Ich will dir alles geben, ein Sach kann ich dir nicht geben. I'll give you everything, the one thing I can't give you is children. On a different occasion, the Alter Rebbe said to him, you have no children. Do you have any idea how many Bailei Tshuva were created from your davening. Al Rebbe said, you have thousands of children, all the Baalei Tshuva, they're created from your davening, these are your children. The bottom line is that Pinchas Reizes died childless. Apparently, the Pinchas Reizes died in Lubavitch. The Mittel Rebbe went to his Levaya. And when the Mittel Rebbe was walking back from the Levaya, the Mittel Rebbe muttered, Der Feldmarschall von Chassidus is weg. Chassidus lost its field marshal. Chassidus lost its field marshal. What's a field marshal? A field marshal is the greatest military officer that's in uniform, right? The highest ranking officer. I mean, who's the head of the United States Army? The President of the United States is the Commander-in-Chief of the Army. The highest ranking officers are in street clothes, are in suits and ties. The highest ranking officer that's actually on the front dressed in military uniform with stripes or bars or stars is the field marshal. And the Mittel Rebbe referred to the Pinchas Reizes as the field marshal. Now, it is my humble opinion that when the Mittel Rebbe said the field marshal of Chassidus died, what he was saying is, and there's not going to be another one. The Alter Rebbe had a field marshal. The Mittel Rebbe had a field marshal. I mean, to say they had a general, a chassid, that they could rely on to lead Chassidim in the direction that they need, that's on the front. Pinchas Reizes died childless. The Mittel Rebbe made this comment. The field marshal of Chassidus is gone. In my opinion, the Mittel Rebbe said, from now on, Chassidus has only a Rebbe. There's no field marshal. In other words, it's not balanced. There's something missing. Now, it doesn't mean that a Rebbe quits. It doesn't mean that a Rebbe retires. It means that things are not that they're supposed to be. But wait, if they're not supposed to be that way, why are they that way? What's the answer? If they're not supposed to be that way, why is it that way? Anybody home? Because the Eibishter wants it to be that way. So evidently, it's supposed to be wrong. It's supposed to be not balanced. Now, the same story, one more time. There was a man named David. He had a brother-in-law who was he loved him, the greatest love two human beings could have. His name was Yehoynasan, Yud Hei Vav, Nasan. Yehoynasan and David together made up Shem Havaya. Yehoynasan represents Giluyim, to use language of our Pasha. Yehoynasan represents Yosef, and David represents Yehuda. Together they made a tandem. Yehoynasan's father was Shaul HaMelech, who was trying to kill David HaMelech. Yehoynasan was protecting Shaul HaMelech. And there was an understanding that one day Shaul would die, whether on the battlefield or in his bed. And when Shaul would die, Yehoynasan would not contend for the throne. He would allow David HaMelech to be the king, and he would be his field marshal. Kabbalistically, if Yehoynasan and David had worked together, you would have the complete Shem Havaya. David is Malchus, Bittel. Yehoynasan is Giluyim, all the lights. Together they would have made a healthy tandem. Yehoynasan was murdered on the same battlefield as his father Shaul. That means before David was able to become the king of all the Jewish people, his field marshal was dead. Meaning, it was messed up. It was wrong. Now, is it supposed to be that way, or is it not supposed to be that way? The Eibishter is the Balabas of the world. Yehoynasan didn't have to die on the battlefield. The Eibishter decided on the battlefield. In other words, Rabbi Yossi, the Eibishter created the way the world should be, and then he didn't let it happen that way. The Eibishter created the world the way the world is supposed to be, and then he offset it. The Eibishter created parity, the Eibishter created balance, and then he broke it. Now, when we learn Torah, we blame it on people. This happened because of this person. This happened because of this person. This happened to the other person. But ultimately, it happened because, to use an old cliche, there is nothing more perfect than accepting imperfection. The Eibishter made a perfect model. But that perfect model is not going to be till Mashiach. That perfect model was offset beginning when Adam and Chava eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And there are multiple examples. I just gave you the same example twice. An example closer to us is the Mittel Rebbe saying that the field marshal of Chassidus is dead. And in my opinion is that he wasn't just talking about a person. He was talking about a prototype. There's no more field marshal. And the same is true with Yehoynasan and David. Which leads me to my second story, Rabbi Yossi. The Alter Rebbe was in Mezritch, by the Mezritcher Maggid. And the Mezritcher Maggid had a very, very exclusive Chassidus, right? The Baal Shem Tov had a very open Chassidus. Anybody who wanted came. The Mezritcher Maggid was a Rebbe over Rebbes. And he hand-picked his disciples. The Mezritcher Maggid handpicked his followers. If he didn't accept you, you were not included. Right? There's how many followers did the Mezritcher Maggid have? He either had 60 or he had 120. But the Mezritcher Maggid chose his followers. They were tzaddikim. I'm sure many of them were even tzaddikim gemurim. But the Mezritcher Maggid personally selected his Chavraya Kadisha. If he didn't choose you, you were not in. Finished.
And he didn't have Pashtir?
No. Right. The Mezritcher Maggid didn't make Bali Tshuva. That's why I have the famous story that the river was churning because he was only a Rebbe of Sikkim. He had no Bali Tshuva. His Talmidim had Bali Tshuva. So he had Bali Tshuva through them. But he himself was involved only with tzaddikim. Here's the story. The Alter Rebbe overheard two of his friends, two Chavim, Talmidei Maggid. And they were discussing what they would do if they were God. There was a conversation, what they would do if they were God. One of them said, if I was God, I would be so nice. I would be so forgiving. I'd be so benevolent. I'd be so generous that people couldn't help but be good. That's what one of them said. One of them said, if I was the Eibishter, I'd be nicer than the Eibishter. And the other one said, if I was the Eibishter, I'd be so vindictive. I'd be so draconian. The punishment for sin would be cause and effect. Reward for good would be cause and effect. People wouldn't get a chance to breathe. They'd all be good because they're so on the edge. So this one is arguing his case, if he was the Eibishter, he'd be nicer than the Eibishter is. And this one's arguing his case, if he was the Eibishter, he'd be meaner than the Eibishter is. And the Alter Rebbe interjects and he says, quote, and if I was the Eibishter, I do exactly what the Eibishter is doing. And that, Rabbi Yossi, is the point. When you read history and you read about all the things that went wrong, right? One of the most unpleasant experiences for a child learning Bereshis is Rachel's dying. You get so angry. How could Rachel die? Yaakov loves her so much and she's so important and Rachel dies. Right? The Eibishter runs the world and he doesn't do what we want, does what he wants. And one of the examples of this is that the field marshal of Chassidus dies, that Yohanes is killed in battle. Okay? And it's this way because it's supposed to be this way. And the same is true with the 10 brothers. The 10 brothers sell Yosef. It's very hard to explain how 10 tzaddikim sold their brother into slavery. It's very, very hard to justify how they did it. It's very hard to explain how good people, we call them tzaddikim, could do such an act of vicious. It's equally hard to explain that because of something that happened 2,000 years before, some king of Rome would decide that he has to kill 10 Tanoim, 10 Gedel, 10 Rebbes, 10 of the greatest Jews who ever lived, to atone for the deaths of the 10 brothers. Yaakov's children, Yosef and Tzaddik's brothers. It's very hard to understand. The only explanation is Hashem. Theoretically, the world is perfect. Actually, the world is not perfect. Why? Because the way it is the way it's supposed to be. And the way it is, the way it's supposed to be, is the only way to understand, number one, why Yosef's brothers sold Yosef, and number two, why this needed to be atoned for by 10 Tanoim who lived a little bit after Churban by Yesheni, and all of the tzaddiks had to be murdered so brutally al Kiddush Hashem by a Malchus Harashah, by an evil king. Okay? Which leads me to our story. It leads me to our story. Yosef's brothers sold him into slavery. I don't know how many years later. Many, many years later. Let's say 2,000 years later. Close to 2,000 years later. A Roman king decides that he's got to avenge their blood and he kills Asad Halugi Maluch. Now whatever that Roman king was thinking is his business. But the Eibishter planned it, right? You read in the Siddur, you read in the Machzir, that when they told Rabbi Shmuel, they told that they're going to take 10 Tanoim and they're going to kill them instead of Yosef's brothers, they asked for 3 days and they went up. Vatiyeh Rabbi Shmuel Atzmei, and he said Hashem, and he went up to the Bezdin Shalmaila and he asked, is this the will of HaKadosh Baruch Hu? And he was told, Kablu Aleichem, this is the Eibishter's judgment. In other words, you're not being killed because some Roman king is a Rasha Merusha. This is the divine will. Now in the Rabbeinu Bechayey here, he brings a different version of that story, that Rabbi Nechuniah ben Akana brought them into the Bezdin Shalmaila, and Rabbi Nechuniah ben Akana brought them to the Shalmaila, and he gave them the information that they are supposed to die. I want to tell you an interesting story. This is a parenthetical story. I heard this from a Stalin Chassid. There's a Chassidus called Karlin Stalin. Karlin Stalin has a hero, a very unusual, very painful story. His name is Reb Shlomo Karliner. Reb Shlomo Karliner is a contemporary of the Alter Rebbe's. He was murdered al Kiddush Hashem in Tov Kufnan Beis in 1792 on Chav Beis Tammuz. Why do I know the date? Because my oldest daughter was born Chav Beis Tammuz, and I was trying to figure out how she has a special birthday. How could she not have a special birthday? She's my daughter. So I look at the Devar Yem B'Yemei. I have a cousin who's a Stoliner. On Chav Beis Tammuz, they make weddings. It's the middle of the 3 weeks, not Sfira. They make chasanis. It's like by Lag B'Yemei by them. The day that Shlomo Karliner was murdered, they consider him Mashiach ben Yosef. The Cossacks. They ran through the city and it was a Shabbos and they killed him in shul.
Like they went into shul safely?
Yeah. I don't know if they were going for him, but they killed him. He was killed. Chav Beis Tammuz Tov Kufnan Beis. They write that he's Mashiach ben Yosef. And Derech Hagav, there's a new book of Sefer Hasichas Nefridik Rebbe which came out about 6 months ago, which I'm struggling through. In the introduction, they have the Frierdiker Rebbe's journal. And in the Frierdiker Rebbe's journal, it says that the Frierdiker Rebbe visited the city of Ludmir, Lamed Vov Dal Mem Yud Reish, where Reb Shlomo Karliner is buried. And the Frierdiker Rebbe went to the tziyun of Shlomo Karliner, and it's a very small cave. He crawled in on his hands and his feet, and he lay down in the cave with Mishateich al HaKever. In the middle, he came out. He gave a bunch of money to tzedakah. He went back in a second time. And in the journal, the Frierdiker Rebbe writes, Mashiach ben Yosef. The Frierdiker Rebbe writes, they say about him that he's Mashiach ben Yosef. Now, it's only the Rebbe's journal, but the Frierdiker Rebbe writes that they say Mashiach ben Yosef. He's not saying that about me. The Shlomo Karliner. So the story that goes with the story is that there was Rabbi Staliner, Rabbi Karliner. Rabbi Staliner was the son of Rabbi Karliner. You have to know Karliner history. There was a father, a Talmud, and a son. The father was Rabbi Gadol. Rabbi Karliner passed away at the age of 30. And he left a 7-year-old boy, Ashel Karliner, Ashel Staliner. He couldn't become a Rebbe as a 7-year-old. So they made the Talmud of Shlomo Karliner Rebbe. After Reb Shlomo, it was the son. It was a father, a Talmud, and a son. Now there's 2 dynasties of Karlin Stalin. One is from Rabbi Gadol, from Bashul, and the other is from Reb Shlomo. When Reb Shlomo Karliner was murdered, Kiddush Hashem, Ashel Stalin was not in Bismedish. He disappeared. He walked out. They said to him, "Where were you?" He says, "I saw what was going to happen. I went to the mikveh, and I toiveled, and I was trying to be mevatel the gzeira. As the Bashul son gesagt, he saw, and I saw I could save Reb Shlomo's life, but they would kill 10,000 Jews. This was the Mishkan. And this is what the Rabbi Shul decided. Here it says in Medrash, 280,000 Jews could have died. 208,000 Jews could have died.
The Karliner was
10,000, that's what I saw. The Rabbi Shul Stalin made the decision to let his Rebbe be murdered, because the alternative would have been 10,000 people. Here it says that to save the Hasadim Alucha would have taken 208,000 Jews, and that the Bechayey ben Akanya took them up, and he showed them that the decision was it should be the 10 Tzaddikim and not the 208,000 Yidden who would have died because of, Cheshbonis. How do you explain Kiddush Hashem? How do you explain Mesidus Nefesh? How do you explain any of this? You can't explain it because it's beyond comprehension. Not because it's bad and because it's... A human mind cannot understand what it means. Forgive me for saying these words. Human sacrifice. Mesidus Nefesh Kiddush Hashem. How many examples do we have that he brings in here? He brings also what the Gemara says. The Gemara says, Asara, Aruge, Melucha, Ein, Adam, Yochel, Abba, Chitasan, the martyrs, people who are murdered, Kiddush Hashem, are in such a high place, nobody can be in their Gan Eden. When the Gemara says, K'mei Rabbi Akiva v'chaveirav, does it mean martyrs, like a people? No, it means papayas and mamayas, I forgot the names. Pashat the Yidden who were killed by Kiddush Hashem to save some girl from being abused. Pashat the Yidden who were not even so frum. A Yid who's murdered al Kiddush Hashem is in the highest heights of heaven. Nobody could go near him. But it's still not something that we could understand. So he brings the Rabbeinu Bechayey that they could have saved Asad Arugim Malucha, would have cost 208,000 Yidden, and the decision was made that they should die and the 208,000 Yidden should live.
Was it 208,000 for the same Kitrug of the Shad?
It seems that way. I read this walking here. The last time I saw this was 25 years ago. So forgive me for not being as a sharp. But this, I read it on the way up. I walked up Troy, Albany Avenue. So that's what it says. Yeah. Now, one last story and then we'll get to our parish. This is a mind-blowing story. I think it's a mind-blowing story. There was a Yid who was in the Madrege of Tzaddik Gomor. You know what Tzaddik Gomor means? It's what Tzaddik means? His food is holy. His food is holy. His food is a korban. When they used to eat tzaddikim, shirayim, from Prelisha tzaddikim, it's because their food was the leftover of a korban, shirei korban. That's what the word shirayim comes from. Shirayim comes from Seder Kochim, from Masechta Zvachim. The leftover korban that we eat, the Koyanim eat the Chatas and the Ashram, the Israelim eat the Shlomim and the Toida, and the El Nazir and so on, as I discussed yesterday in the Siddur class, it's called shirei korban. They were human beings on this earth whose food was holy. There's a maimah from the Rebbe Rashaba, Yishlach Tafir Samaches, Pada B'Shalom, I think, or Yishlach, which explains this. His name was Avraham Yeshua Heschel of Apta. Rabbi Sternberg downstairs is a descendant of his. Avraham Yeshua Heschel. The Apta Rav lived 87 years. He had a very long life. He ended up becoming the Rebbe of all the Rebbes because his contemporaries all died. The Rebbe Melech had 4 Talmidim, the Choyze, Milublin, Yisrael of Kodesh, and Mendel of Rimenov, and the Apta Rav. The other 3 died to try to bring Mashiach and Tov Kuf Ayin Hey. That means in 1814. He lived through the generation of the Mittler Rebbe till Pei Zayin, which is 1827. So he became the Rebbe of all the Peilisha by default, the Apta Rav. He was a big critic of the Alter Rebbe. He was against the Derech of Chabad. Doesn't matter.
I thought the Chayzer was the thing of Rabbi Melech.
Of Rebbe Melech, yeah. He was the Rebbe of all the Rebbes in Peilim. Rebbe Melech, yeah. The Apta Rav used to say on Yom Kippur, he was the Chazan, V'kach ha'yisi yomer. When he was the Kohen Gadol, V'kach ha'yomer, the Kohen Gadol used to say, he would say V'kach. He remembered every Gilgul, and he said, I was once a Kohen Gadol, and he would say, not V'kach ha'yomer, he would say B'mamid. This is what I used to say. Achas, achas, v'achas, achas, v'shtayim, achas, v'sholish, achas, v'arba, achas, v'chabish, achas, v'sheish, achas, v'sheva, v'esav, v'loyayim, achav, v'lhazes, le'lamayla, v'lamat, el-kamatzav. He would say, v'kach ha'yisi oimed. The Apta Rav knew every Gilgul. And by the way, the Alter Rebbe's Chassidim started up with him. And the Alter Rebbe asked him to describe his anhog, and the Alter Rebbe said, I'll take the Kpeid off this time, but don't mess with him again, as an Adam Gadol. The Alter Rebbe said about the Apta Rav as an Adam Gadol.
The guy who actually walked into the shul?
Huh?
The guy who actually walked
Yeah.
out of his grandchildren?
Yeah.
But it kind of good though, like, so why did he like come back? Didn't like if you have a full life?
Okay, the questions we'll save for Q&A for Thursday night. I'm already 9 o'clock. I'm going to be at least till 9:20. But the Apta Rav had another Gilgul. The Apta Rav had a birthmark on his back, which was a red stripe that ran across the back at an angle. And the Apta Rav said, listen to this, I was a sheep in Yaakov Avinu's herds. And Yaakov Avinu was Makayim all the mitzvahs. He was even Makayim the mitzvah of Meiser. And when he counted sheep and he got to the 10th one, he hit it with a belt with red paint. And my red birthmark is because I was Meiser from Yaakov Avinu's sheep. So you want to talk about generations. You want to talk about Gegulim. Yosef Yitzchak HaLevi. Listen to this. A tzaddik gomer in the times of the Alter Rebbe, the Mittler Rebbe, was an animal in the times of Yaakov Avinu. Yaakov Avinu had Shepsen that were not neshamas. They were gigantic neshamas. Nu, so stell sich vor what this all is about. How do we understand what this means?
Or can have a Jewish soul to convert?
Okay, leave these questions alone, please. What's the point? The point is, first of all, we understand very little of what's going on under the surface. A person is a person. He walks on 2 feet. He has 2 eyes. He has 2 noses. His eyes are in the sides of his head, are in the middle of his head, right in the sides of his head. So he has binocular vision, but he doesn't see to his side. Whatever a human being is. But some of us are in higher madrigas. Some of us are in higher madrigas. Some of us are not in this world b'chlal. The argument of the Rabbeinu Bechayey is, and I'm putting these in my own words now, if the Apta Rav was a tzaddik gom in times of the Alter Rebbe, was a sheep in the times of Yaakov Avinu, so the Rabbeinu Bechayey says the gufes of the Asara Harugei Malucha, Rabbi Shmuel Kohen Gadol and Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, Rabbi Chutzos HaMeturgam and Rabbi Sheva VaSefer and Rabbi Akiva ben Yosef, Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava and Rabbi Chani ben Teradien were the Ksenis Pasim of Yosef HaTzadik. Their body was like Yosef's shirt. The Apterov was like Yaakov Avinu's animal. Their gufes were the Ksenes Pas, meaning to say, the Ksenes Pas of Yosef HaTzadik was so holy, it was so organic, that the gufes of big tzaddikim were in the same madrege of Yosef HaTzadik's Ksenes Pas. In other words, if you can understand how the Apterov, who was a tzaddik gom in the times of the Alter of the Mittler Rebbe, was an animal in the times of Yaakov Avinu, you could equally understand that a beged, that a shirt, a malbush, which is a daimim, or whatever, it's daimim shebetzimech, daimim shebechai, in the times of Yosef HaTzadik would be the gufes of big tzaddikim. And they were killed not for selling Yosef, they were killed for taking the Kesenes Pasim and tabling it in blood. This is how the Rabbeinu Bechayey presents the story, that their 10 bodies were murdered to atone for taking the shirt, the tunic of Yosef HaTzadik. And of course, the Chazal say about tzaddikim, Mamoinim chavev aleim Yosef megufam, their wealth is more valuable to them than their body, because they're in their wealth. The Ksenes Pas of Yosef HaTzadik was so holy, and they violated it, and because they violated, you had to have that Sara Rugi Melucha to atone for this Aveda. Okay? Now, what's the point? I gave you 3 introductions. The point is, you cannot say that if the world would be perfect, Yosef would be sold. You cannot say that the world would be perfect, Adam and Chava would eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. You cannot say that the world would be perfect, Yonasan would be killed in a battle. You know, in a world to be perfect, Shaul would never become king in the first place. You cannot say that the world would be perfect, that the 10 tzaddikim gemurim, the Tanoim, on which the whole Torah of Rabbe's base would be killed by a Rasha Merusha, a Roman king, because who found himself a way of killing Jews and blaming it on the Jewish people themselves. But the world isn't perfect. And it isn't perfect by the Eibishter's design. And in the words of the Alter Rebbe, the way the world is exactly how the world is supposed to be. The world we live in is exactly the world we're supposed to have. Lo poches v'lo yeseh, not less and not more. Why? This is what Eibishter wants. A little bit we can explain it, a little bit we can understand it, what Eibishter wants. I once gave a lecture to non-from people. And I talked about one of my favorite subjects. It's a very controversial. I talk about it here a lot. In the world, everybody talks about things being fair. Let's be fair. They can't be rich and poor, it's not fair. They can't be healthy and sick, it's not fair. So because of all these diseases, you have all kinds of efforts at making things fair. The English word for fair is parity. Parity means everything is the same. So I gave him a simple argument. According to physicists, when the Big Bang occurred, right, 5,782 years ago, and all of matter and time-space came into being in an instant, and the entire expansion of space happened right away, and then it stopped expanding. That's my version. And there's a Medrash that says this. There was an equal amount of matter and antimatter. I've never met antimatter, and I know one thing. I don't want to meet antimatter. Antimatter, when it meets matter, produces a destructive force which makes nuclear fusion and nuclear fission look like a baby. When matter and antimatter meet, it's the release of pure energy. Nobody understands why, but in the first instances after the Big Bang, there became disparity. There's much, much more matter than antimatter. There is antimatter in the universe, but it's very insignificant. There's a whole theory that says that if we can harness the power of antimatter, we can create incredible energy sources. If you bring matter and antimatter together, they cancel each other completely. It produces an enormous amount of energy. Now, what would have happened if in the beginning of the universe, the balance between matter and antimatter had been exact? You know what would have happened? There'd be no universe. All matter would be destroyed, finished. In other words, the very basis for reality is that it's not fair. If there would be perfect parity, the matter and the antimatter cancel each other out, and there'd be nothing. There'd be nothing. I don't know if there'd be time, space, there'd be no matter. There'd be nothing. So the very foundation of life is that things are not exact. They're not balanced. You have a right hand and a left hand. They're not the same. You have a right hand and a left hand. They're not the same.
Purpose is to make it balanced.
Huh?
Purpose is to make it balanced.
The purpose is to make it balanced in a sustainable way. But that only happens through work, through our work. But the world that the Eibishter made, for it to be a world, has to have a lack of parity. Now, this is not justifying, but it does explain Chatei Tzadas, it does explain Yosef's brothers telling Yosef, the Yid have to go to Mitzrayim, right? If they're going to go to Mitzrayim, Yosef has to be sold. There's no other way to arrange it. It has to happen this way. In a perfect universe, of course not. In the world that God created, yes. Why? Because if I was God, says the Alter Rebbe, I would do exactly what God was doing. And the same is true about the Asar Harugim Melucha. This is not random. It is part of a plan and a purpose and a direction. And if you're smart enough and you're sensitive enough, perhaps you can understand it. But it's based on the fact that the world God created lacks parity. In other words, Hashem did create a perfect world, and then He unperfected it, b'kavanah, because that's how the purpose is realized. There's a lot of mysticism to this, but the details are not important. Here's the bottom line. So when you read the story of Asar Harugim Melucha, understand, in the perfect universe it doesn't happen. But Hashem didn't create a perfect universe. He created an inexact universe. And as I said to you before, there's nothing more whole than a broken heart. There's nothing more exact than an inexact universe which exists, as opposed to an exact universe that self-destructs. Right? And the same is true in people. None of us are perfect, but in our imperfection we're able to function. If all of us were perfect, the world would not be as perfect as it is. It would be a much more destructive world, because we would cancel each other. And this is not explaining why the Asar Melucha happened, but it explains why part of the design of creation is that these kinds of tragedies should occur. Okay? It's all part of the divine plan. And of course the way you understand it is, these are terrible events. But these terrible events have an unbelievable upside, because we live in the schus. We live in the schus of these martyrs. Yom Kippur, we mentioned Asar Harugim Melucha. I mean, the biggest schus that we have was, you mentioned Akedas Yitzchak. Every chance. Because we look at Akedas Yitzchak as being something which actually occurred. Yitzchak was ready to die. Avraham was ready to shecht Yitzchak Avinu, and we say, the ash of Yitzchak, most ash has to be taken out of the Beis HaMikdash and thrown away in the Shefach HaDeshen. The ash of Yitzchak sits on the Mizbeach, because we live on that Mesiras Nefesh, and on a different level, we live on the Mesiras Nefesh of the Asar Harugim Melucha, we live on the Mesiras Nefesh of the 10 Martyrs. As the Gemara says, Asar Harugim Melucha, Einan Yochalam B'nim Chitzasan. We can't understand the greatness of the Mesiras Nefesh of Kiddush Hashem. I want you to know that the Rebbe spoke about this a lot. And he spoke about this specifically in conjunction with the yahrzeit of his own father. Rebbe Leivik died in his bed, but he was killed by the Soviets. He got cancer, he died at the age of 66 years old. Rebbe Leivik was strong as an ox, he could have lived 100. He got sick and he died because of wear and tear. His guf was exhausted from the stress. They killed him. And the Rebbe spoke about the Mesiras Nefesh of Kiddush Hashem. And the Rebbe brought a very, very, very tragic example. The Beis Yosef, Rabbi Yosef Paltiel, lived a very long life. He lived into his 90s. And he wrote the most important Sfarim we have. The Kesef Mishnah commentary on Rambam, the Beis Yosef commentary on Tur, and then his own Shulchan Aruch plus other Sfarim. Rabbi Yosef Paltiel was told by a Magid, by a Malach that came from heaven, by a Neshama that came from heaven, that he's going to die al Kiddush Hashem. He's going to be killed al Kiddush Hashem, like the Asar Harugim Melucha. Then he did something wrong. I don't know what kind of Aveda he did, but he did something wrong. And the consequence of that wrong was that schus was taken away from him. He was not going to die al Kiddush Hashem, he was going to die in his bed. Nebuch, instead of dying al Kiddush Hashem, he was going to die in his bed. And the Rebbe said, so he didn't die al Kiddush Hashem, he lived long. He lived long, he wrote Sfarim, including the most important Sfarim in the world, that the whole Jewish world, Sfardim and Ashkenazim Lina, the Kesef Mishnah, the Beis Yosef, and the Shulchan Aruch, the Mechaber, Maron. So the Rebbe says, so it turns out that for one individual person to be Mesiras Nefesh Kiddush Hashem is a greater madrege for everybody, not for himself, than writing the Kesef Mishnah and Rambam, the Beis Yosef, and the Torah, and the Shulchan Aruch. If the Oynesh was that because the Beis Yosef was not allowed to die al Kiddush Hashem, he wrote these 3 Sfarim. Kumtais, that when a person is Mesiras, I remember when Mrs. Lapine died, which was 2 weeks before the Rebbe's stroke, and the Rebbe was so upset. He took it so personally. The Rebbe had a public debate with God. He said, "You happy now? You happy now? Now it's enough." The Rebbe was really upset. And at one point, the Rebbe actually said, "I better stop talking because something not good could come out." And 2 weeks later was the stroke. The Rebbe was so upset. He took it so personally. The inyan of Mesiras Nefesh al Kiddush Hashem. So the Asara Aruge Melucha are in this class. To be comfortable with this idea, you have to be cruel. To understand this idea, you have to have a cold mind. But to feel that it's not for nothing. And when Yidna Meis Nefesh Al Kiddush Hashem, something incredibly real takes place. It's not just an unnecessary death. This we must. I heard from the Rebbe with these ears, by myself. It's one of the things I will never forget. And I found it in the Sikha later, and I've referenced it since. The Rebbe said by a Fabrengen, it was a weekday Fabrengen, did a tape of it. I don't like when people talk about what happened in the 1940s as a Holocaust, as genocide. They used the word genocide, not Holocaust. It wasn't genocide. And then he said with an enormous amount of emotion, 6 million Yidden gegangen lekadish Shem Shamayim barabim zayin. 6 million Jews went to sanctify the name of God in a public way. But he said it with so much emotion. Now, there are things that the Rebbe said that only a Rebbe could say. If I said it, it would be cruel. But the Rebbe said it. The 6 million Jews were not murdered by the Nazis. They were human korbanos. It was Kiddush Hashem. To agree with it, to understand it, you have to be a Rosh Marush. But to appreciate that for reasons which are beyond anybody's comprehension, events like these cannot be seen only tragically. But there's also the element of Kiddush Hashem is axiomatic to our Emunah. And if it's true of the 6 million, it's certainly true of the Asara Aruge Malchus, of the 10 Martyrs, that their death was even Kiddush Hashem. It sanctified the name of the Eibishter in public. And finally, my last point, and this I'm going to finish with, the idea that Rabbi Akiva is against the Eibishter. I started with this, right? There's 10 martyrs. Each one dies for one of the 9 Shvatim who were involved in the sale of Yosef. Who was the 10th? The 10th died for the Eibishter. So the Eibishter is involved in Mechiras Yosef. If the Eibishter is involved in Mechiras Yosef, that means the Eibishter orchestrated, the Eibishter partnered in one of the most evil acts in the Tanakh. Why? Because what God does is exactly what needs to be done. If I was God, I would do exactly as God does. The Eibishter created a perfect world, and He unperfected it. And one of the many aspects of that unperfecting it is the Mechiras Yosef. And then as a consequence of that, you have the Asara Aruge Melucha. It's all part of the fact that the world is not perfect, and the unperfect world is more perfect than the perfect world would ever be, but it's very hard for us to understand it. Who dies for the Eibishter? Rabbi Akiva ben Yosef. Who's Rabbi Akiva ben Yosef? Rabbi Akiva ben Yosef was a Ben Gerim. His father was a Geir. So you should know that there's a Tshuvas HaRambam, which the Rebbe talks about often. It was written Rabbi Vadia HaGeir. I have the Tshuva. I mean, I have all the Tshuvas of the Rambam, but I've looked this Tshuva up more than once. Where Rabbi Vadia HaGeir, he was a Geir Tzedek. He asked the Rambam about saying Elokei Aviseinu, right? In Shpenesa, Elokei Aviseinu, Elokei Avraham, Elokei Yankov. How can I say Elokei Aviseinu? Avraham is not my father. I'm a Geir Tzedek. So the Rambam brought the source of this. Right? What's the first example you have in Halacha where a Geir cannot say Aviseinu? By Bikurim. Right? By Bikurim, you come and you bring a fruit gift to the Beis HaMikdash, and you thank Hashem for the audit. You thank Hashem for the land. Asher nasata laviseinu. Geirei tzedek do not have a chelik ba'aretz. Righteous converts don't have a piece in Eretz Yisrael. In fact, even Yisrei didn't really have a piece in Eretz Yisrael, even though he was told ve'itav nulach to get a piece of Eretz Yisrael. I mean, when Mashiach comes, it's going to be different. But Geirei tzedek historically did not get a piece in Eretz Yisrael. So the Rambam brings this shaila about saying Asher nasata laviseinu by bikurim. I think a Geirei tzedek is maybe ve'enei keiri bikurim. He doesn't say aviseinu. The Rambam paskin that when he says Shmoneh, he could say Elokeinu v'kei aviseinu. And the Rambam wrote some very beautiful things. And the two of the statements that the Rambam writes that the Yeres HaKodesh is, number one, he writes, you're not Elokei Aviseinu, you're Elokei Avram. You're the son of Avram. But he also writes in the same letter, you're not Elokei Avram, you're Elokei Misha Omar V'ha, you're a son of God. The Rambam writes that every Ger Tzedek, he's not a son of Avram, he's not a son of Yitzchak, he's not a son of Yankov, he's a son of the Eibishter himself. So it makes sense that Rabbi Akiva ben Gerim should be V'mkaimesh ala Kadosh Baruch Hu. But you have to understand further. The Gemara, what the Gemara says about Rabbi Akiva, right? The story that he met one of the oldest Tanoim, and he said to him, Shmoi me'ira me'seifa eile matzeifa. It was said about Rabbi Akiva. He told him, your Torah shines one end of the world to the other. The Chazal say about Rabbi Akiva that in the times of Rabbi Akiva, Haya Ha'olam Shamim, all the Tanoim died, all the Tzaddikim died, all the Bnei Torah died, and there was a desert of Torah in the world. Rabbi Akiva took 5 Talmidim, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Elazar, and Rabbi Meir. And with these 5 Talmidim, he rebuilt the whole Torah. And the Gemara says what each one of these 5 Talmidim contributed, and then the Gemara finishes, Kulu Ali B'Rabbi Akiva. All the Torah we have today, Nigla and Kabbalah. Rabbi Shimon is one of the 5 Talmidim, is Rabbi Akiva's. So Rabbi Akiva was a son of a non-Jew who converted to Judaism, who was the greatest source of Torah ever, really. Rabbi Akiva is in that class of people that if you made a short list of the greatest Jews who ever lived, or at least the most important Jews who ever lived, Rabbi Akiva would be on that list. Rabbi Akiva was incredibly important. He was a Gadol Shebegdelim in Torah, and in his chus we have Torah. And Rabbi Akiva dies. So I just said 2 reasons why Rabbi Akiva ben Yosef is instead of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Number 1, because he's a Ben Gedim, and Gedim are called Bnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And number 2, because the whole Torah that we have nowadays traces it back to the Mishnah, and to the Braise, and to the Zoyar, and to the Sifrei Kabbalah, is all Rabbi Akiva's Torah. So our Parshas Miketz finishes with the words, Alu l'sholom l'avichem shebashamayim, Asar Harugei Melucha went up to their father in heaven, and the Gemara says about them, Harugei Melucha ein adam yochal lamber b'chitzas, when people are murdered al Kiddush Hashem, they were the highest madrege. But the Nekuda is, it's enough. So genug. It's the daf mahab and the gula mitzvah shleim. Okay, let's daven.